What does a detailed and exhaustive new study into how Latter-day Saints view, understand, and wear garments tell us about the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Few topics receive as much attention in popular culture about Mormonism than their so-called magic underwear. I've done previous videos on the topic, including a video on the history and evolution on garments that I recommend going to check out. I'll add a link in the video description. This is a topic that once again has been in the news of late as the church has introduced sleeveless garments, which raises questions concerning cultural adaptation, changes, as well as a simultaneous call for Latter-day Saints to wear their garments at all times. Well, thankfully, we have a brand new book on the topic that uses a massive study of modern Latter-day Saints that brings new insights. Nancy Ross, Jessica Finnegan, and Larissa Cano Kindred, their book Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret, just out from the University of Illinois Press. Not to give a spoiler in this video, but I really enjoyed the book and I recommend going to get a copy. It's an important and fascinating contribution to the scholarly literature that is also of interest to the general public. So in this video, I hope to do a few things. One, briefly introduce the video and what it aims to do. Two, interview two of the three authors. And three, provide some concluding thoughts and highlights, as well as some of my main takeaways from the volume. Over a decade ago, during the Mormon moment of Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign, the scholars Nancy Ross and Jessica Finnegan became interested in the ways that Mormon views of garments have changed and evolved and become a point of public spectacle. They opened this book with an anecdote of Ann Romney going on Jay Leno's Tonight Show, which prompted a lot of backlash from some Latter-day Saints of saying that is too short of a skirt to wear garments, which of course prompted many other Latter-day Saints to say, how dare you try to garment check and police the wearing. And those types of conversations, of course, have a deep history in the Latter-day Saint Church and also modern context. So these two scholars then set out to do a survey in 2014 that quickly overwhelmed them. They hoped to get, in their words, around 500 responses. Instead, they got 4,529. And even more than just the quantity was the quality of the responses. Because in response to some open-ended questions with the text box, thousands of Latter-day Saints bore their souls of their experiences with and views of garments, providing fascinating, detailed, and nuanced takes that transcended the scholars' initial views. So very quickly they pivoted. Rather than merely exploring how men and women experience garments differently, which is their initial object, a topic maybe for one or two articles, they instead broadened out into a larger thematic argument that became this monograph. Soon they brought in Larissa Cano Kindred as a third author, and they focused on the variety of these experiences. They received, this is how they describe the data set, a giant tangled mess of stories, experiences, and meanings for garments that was not easy to explain. Gender alone did not explain the huge range of survey experiences. So they went in, and their final thesis is that this, quote, garments are a religious technology for restraining the sexual behavior of LDS adults, which seems simple enough and true enough to my ears, but they also found the wide diversity in how that technology is transcended in the hands of Latter-day Saints. And so their approach was to use both their own experiences, the experience in the data, as informed by history. This is how they explain it. They use an autoethnographic approach that inserts their own lives. While all three do not currently identify as LDS, they all spent considerable time as active and believing members, retain strong connections to the community, and express a respect for those still within the fold. And I found that to be true, that while they themselves are no longer active or believing, that they give a lot of sympathy and respect to those people they are studying. They end up grouping their responses into four groups: 2 men, 2 women, each defined on either conforming or non-conforming. So conforming and unconforming men, and conforming and non-conforming women. And here are some of their key insights: that the level of belief often impacts how the individuals wear garments, whether they see it as restrictive or fulfilling, which makes sense, but they're able to nuance that in important ways. That women have an exceptionally broad and variety of views and practices, especially non-conforming women. If you were to look at the spectrum of how they believe and practice garments, it is incredibly broad, which shows a degree of adaptation within the powerful priesthood patriarchal structure. And finally, that garments serve a function similar to Foucault's panopticon, which here's a famous panopticon from Jeremy Bentham in the past, the idea that members are always being observed and surveilled, and garments provide one of those opportunities. So those are some of the key insights. I could highlight many others, but I think that's enough to at least give you a gist of the book and its approach. Before I go much further, my awkward yet obligatory pitch for this channel: if you enjoy this type of nerdy historical analysis, please make sure you are a follower of this channel. Hit that follow button, and also please hit the like button for these videos so they can get a broader reach. If you want to give back, and I'm so grateful to the many of you who have given back, you can become a member, where for a very nominal monthly fee, you get early access to videos, you get little icons next to your name, and most importantly, you are helping support this video and this channel and its continuation. I try to do deep dives on historical topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present on every Wednesday, and on Fridays I pull back the curtain, talk about the historian's craft, including interviews with authors like this one. I recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter. There's a link in the video description. Please make sure to confirm your subscription after you hit the link. That confirming email usually goes to the junk mail box. And follow me on different social media platforms: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, because I have other shorter videos that help supplement these larger videos. And also mark your calendars. My next live discussion that I do every first Wednesday of the month will be Wednesday, March 4th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. It's going to be a lot of fun. I always look forward to those discussions. Anyways, let's get back to the history. You've heard enough from me. Let's talk with the actual authors of this book, at least two of them. And to introduce them, Dr. Nancy Ross received her PhD from the University of Cambridge and is currently an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies at Utah Tech University. Larissa Cano-Kindred is a PhD candidate in counseling psychology at Tennessee State University. Sadly, Jessica Finnegan was not able to join us on the call, but she is an independent scholar, one of the co-authors of this book, and I actually overlapped with her back at Cambridge over a decade ago, and I'm thrilled to see her involved in this great project. So without further ado, let's get to the discussion with Nancy and Larissa. I am now very grateful to be joined by two of the authors of this new book, Nancy Ross and Larissa Kindred, who are so kind in sharing some of their time with me to answer some questions so we can dig more into the meat of this volume. So let's start with a broader question that kind of fits into the very title of the book, Sacred and Secret, because it's remarkable how much the LDS Church's stance on the secrecy portion has changed during the duration of this project. Most notably, since you started doing the researching and the polling to now, the church became a lot more open about talking about the garments, its appearance, and its meaning. So how did you react to those changes now that the garments are still deemed sacred, but perhaps not as secret anymore?
So that's a really interesting question. We were just talking about this with Jana Reese yesterday, and Jessica, who was not able to be here today, but very much part of this project, commented that that we see influencers. So first of all, mind blown when I first saw influencers trying to sell me back on garments like 15 months ago. I saw, I was just scrolling mindlessly on TikTok, as you do after work, just trying to clear your head. And I got 3 of them in a row, out of nowhere, and then 3 in a row. And I was like, I have never seen anything like this. I never expected to see anything like this. This is wild. I think I said to my husband, Russ, drop what you're doing. We've got to watch these again together. This is just really unexpected. But it's also, I would say that the public conversation that is permitted by the church is very limited. years ago, just as Jessica and I were starting this project, they created the church newsroom, put out a YouTube video. And one of the things which we talk about in our book was encountering this video where the church, and this video has been remade and recut a number of times over the last 10 years. It's something that I've used in different research and teaching conversations around garments. And so I've been able to track the progress. They talk a lot about how garments as vestments for ordained people. And as someone who was very much involved in ordained women, and I'm like, this is news to me that my garments, because I was wearing garments at the time, mean that I am, like a prospective elder in the church or something, because that was the whole, I thought we did a whole thing about that. And that the church came down on the side of, in fact, women don't have the priesthood, but actually maybe sometimes we maybe have an extension of the priesthood, but definitely can't be ordained to an office. And, I thought we had done this dance before. And so but we recognized that this YouTube video was for a public facing audience and that this did not reflect the internal conversation. But this started to paint a picture for us like, oh, there are all these different ways that the church is trying to navigate the awkwardness of secrecy in public life today, where the internet is so disruptive with regard to how we understand something like religious secrecy. Sorry, and I am just desperate to go. I'm always a little desperate to dive into the weeds and get on a tangent in my comments. So I'm going to try and rein that in. But I would also say that what we see in TikTok today is a lot of very positive commentary on garments from LDS influencers who are trying to celebrate in many ways the awkwardness of wearing garments in a public space, while not really discussing at all the lived experience of wearing garments and the challenge of the lived experience. And that is something our book really dives into. So yes, there's a lot more public comment, but I don't think that public comment or that perceived new reduced secrecy, in fact, reveals many of the things that are still very awkward and difficult to discuss about garments. So, yeah.
That's and to me, it's so fascinating because it just shows the further adaptation according to times, right? That we now live in an age where most people push transparency.
Yes.
And secret underwear does not really match that.
No.
And further, trying to perform that in an individualized setting means something different now. So while your book is mostly focused on this modern survey, you do tie back into history. And what I found is a very useful and smart historical overview. And there are two anecdotes that I found so fascinating in that historical chapter that capture some of these central themes. One was the historian Juanita Brooks, who anyone who's familiar with that channel knows I regard as one of the true heroes of Mormon history.
Amen.
And her father's visceral reaction to the garment style changes in the 1920s, where he's like, these aren't as pure as they used to be.
Right.
And so the changes are too much for some, but not enough for others, because in the very next decade, you have Mormon women proposing to church leaders, well, why don't we have sleeveless garments, right?
Mm-hmm.
A century ago. And so what do these stories tell us about the tensions between adapting to the new age, but still trying to retain this core and not giving in to the society?
And this is absolutely at the heart of the tension around garments. So I am actually writing a further book on garment history for Signature. And I've uncovered another comment from Juanita Brooks in writing to Dale Morgan, where she comments very specifically that it is the Jack Mormons that really help change the church's attitude to things, and not faithful members, which the church has a really hard time listening to. And so, but I think that comment really sums up that it is these tensions with the outside world where, the church in the 20th century really wants to be mainstream. It wants to be understood, appreciated, validated, legitimized, like other conservative Christian groups in the modern world. And at the same time, its distinctive features, which are an important part of its history, and how and it has tried to use some of those features and adapt them for the purpose of assimilation, which is what I would argue what garments are also trying to do. But it's still awkward. And so it is the secrecy that helps maintain these tensions. And I would argue that it is still this secrecy about the awkwardness, about the messiness of the lived experience that the churches try so hard to kind of keep hidden, which is embarrassing when that wall is broken through. And so I feel like these tensions of what is divinely mandated and how is that fixed and how is it not fixed, and how do we understand things do we understand our history literally, or do we understand it flexibly? Like, to what extent does historical precedent serve as a must for the present, or is there enough wiggle room within the framing of continuing revelation? I feel like garments are such a great example of these tensions that shape Mormon history in such foundational ways.
And Larissa, I know that your background and expertise is in more modern stuff, but I'm wondering, as you dove into this history and learned about the history, did a lot of this ring true to your own experience and thoughts?
Yeah, one thing that I'm very interested in is some like cross-cultural type comparisons with religious clothing. And one thing that I found very interesting once digging into the history is kind of tracking it along with like evangelical narratives about purity and clothing. And so I think that was a very, very interesting thing, is to kind of, just track like how it had developed over time. And it's interesting because going back to this like Juanita Brooks anecdote, Nancy's kind of talking about like these tensions still exist, and I think we're going to see more and more of that exact same type of thing. Whenever I also see these influencers, I'm fascinated by them. I always get in the comments because I know that's where the interesting things are going to happen. But I have seen many members now say, like, I know that they're sleeveless ones, but you weren't supposed to be wearing them. They were supposed to be for people in these types of climates. And so I think there's like this same level of kind of like certain people that are like, ooh, I think they went too far, we shouldn't have done that. And, and then the people that are like, well, can we do this now if we can have sleeveless garments? And so it's so interesting to see like the through thread of like, this was like a cultural dynamic that the church was struggling with, like as part of their identity, a long time ago, and this is still like moving forward. And so, yeah, so kind of like seeing some of those like threads like come through like through the history, and they're very relevant now. And also we see them in other cultures, other religious groups. That's always kind of the thing that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, very well said. Very interesting. So let's talk about this, the survey and the research project at the heart of this book, because this is one of those very rare scholarly cases in which you dive into a project and get far more material than you expected, which in turn then alters your overall questions and approach. So yeah. How did your thesis evolve from simply positing that men and women must have different experiences with garments to something much more nuanced and profound?
So this was this has been at the heart of the challenge of this project, which is, and I've said this elsewhere, that like Jessica and I really hoped that we might get as many as 500 responses. We got more than 4,500. We got them in a week. It was this flood of data that we were not expecting. People generally don't write in the box, right? And write long responses to open-ended survey questions. We got a lot of people writing in the box. And very quickly, we realized that we didn't even have the tools that we needed to process the data that we had. And so where we'd hoped to like write a paper and move on with our lives and, and to put this behind us, we realized that in order very quickly, and we wrote many versions of many early failed papers that tried to account for all of these things, and some never went out for review because it was deemed, editors were like, well, I checked in with a Mormon colleague and apparently you're not supposed to write about this stuff. So we got a lot of those desk rejects and the how dare yous, and so we got a lot of that. And the more of those that we got, the more we realized, and sitting together with some different kinds of the peer review feedback we got, that we really just needed to sit with this more. We needed to find more tools. We needed to go and acquire more skills, and just to figure out what the bigger piece, recognizing that there was a bigger piece in this process and that there was something more, and it wasn't low-hanging fruit, it wasn't obvious, but that if we sat with it long enough, if we got more skills, if we read in a whole bunch of different directions, that we would find that we would get to the end one day. And a couple of years ago, when I started reading some more of like Sarah Mosliner's work by Amy DeRogatis, I started to realize where we might go, to realize, together with some feedback that we got from Liberty Barnes, who's a friend and sociologist, that we did need to write a history chapter, which is something I'd resisted for a long time, because it was yet more work, and damn it, we'd done enough, it's so. But it was really wrestling with our own skills, realizing we needed to acquire more data handling and data management skills, and realizing we just needed to get a clearer picture of things. It was probably also reading things like Jesus and John Wayne, and realize, okay, we need to figure out how to bring the evangelical purity culture conversation into dialogue with the Mormon purity culture conversation, which really only existed in blog posts and we don't have like the Mormon Jesus and John Wayne. We don't yet have the Mormon versions of the work of Amy DeRogatis and Sarah Mosliner yet, but picking up on some of those threads and sitting with a lot of things, realizing we should help to make the book more narrative, and we would make it more narrative by including our own personal stories, and that would help us connect some of these threads in ways that were going to help us come to a bigger, clearer narrative and direction for the book. But sometimes a project is easy and you just answer the question and you just move on with your life. And sometimes you have to realize when you're sitting on a gold mine and it's just going to take a while and you're going to sweat blood over it, and just allowing ourselves the time and the space to kind of pick it up and put it down, and pick it up and put it down, and to learn more and grow more as scholars has been wildly productive for us in this project. So that is a long answer, but
it turns out slow and careful scholarship is often the most substantial. Who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
Yeah. So, Larissa, one of the things that really stood out to me in this book is every one of the chapters begins with someone's perspective, one of you three authors, which is often, quite moving and telling and places some flesh on the skeletal story. But I'm curious, how do you balance using your own experiences to make sense of the survey, right? Relating it to a shared human experience, as well as ground those theories in a lived reality, while still not forcing your own interpretation and your own experience onto those of others?
Yeah, I think this is like the most, it's kind of like the meat of like this work is that, I think researcher identity is so important. Like it plays such a huge role. And, like those of us that work in research, we want to believe that we're objective, but in reality, nobody is all the way objective. We try to be as objective as possible. And so one thing that I think is very interesting about working with LDS populations is, like many other religious groups, you see a high degree of social desirability where people will answer in a way that kind of like makes them, makes them sound good, or, like this is what people want to hear. And so I think that Nancy and Jessica and I had to access our identities as people who have lived experience in the church. We had to access those to really, really like have this relationship with the people that are part of this research. You can imagine, like, if somebody that didn't know about the LDS community came in and asked, they would get very, very different answers than somebody who was like, hey, I wore garments. because I knew the conversations that had happened, like, at Relief Society or, like at a church activity. I know what women are saying, and it's different than what is being said, to just the general public. And so I think that we knew that we had to access our own identities to really get the richness of this, of like the data. But like you said, I think there's just like this constant question of like, am I applying my own personal experiences to this? And I think, I think this type of research requires like checkpoints like consistently along the way to make sure that you are staying kind of grounded in like whatever your theoretical framework is. And for me and for Nancy and Jessica, like, we really use like feminist research methods, which it inherently ask you to look at yourself and to use those checkpoints along the way to really address biases, because I think it's very, very easy to infuse your own analysis into it. And so I almost think that like it's kind of futile to say like, I'm going to do this and then I'm not going to add my own personal, like I'm not going to let that affect me. I think the only way to be effective at that is to say, my bias will likely come into this. And so how do I do this? And I know with some of my personal research that I've done, I actually use focus groups of active LDS women of different ages, different demographics to check it. Because normally they will be like, I don't like the wording on this. This feels judgmental, or like, it sounds like you're leading me. And so, so I think really engaging in a participatory way with the community and saying like, how is this helpful? Or, how are you reading this? Or how is this coming off to you? I think that that's a thing, but it's definitely an ongoing process where our own identities are both an asset and a liability. And so it's like a careful balance to find.
It's a good reminder of why I love to choose my subjects who are long dead and can't talk back to my analysis.
Yes.
One of the fascinating aspects of your data survey is how Mormon women, both conforming and non-conforming, the two categories you come up for each of the genders, have such a broad range of both experiences and ideas concerning garments. I think this is important because it disrupts this traditional assumptions of a homogenous experience, that everyone is experiencing the same way. So how should we understand this broad level of flexibility and what I would say is creativity among Mormon women in response to garments?
So that's a great question. And I'm a little hesitant with the language of creativity, because I think we want to understand that there is so much social and religious pressure to engage in this practice. And so understanding and foregrounding that pressure, and then helps us understand the meaning-making mechanisms better, because if you are, as many women are, find garments physically uncomfortable, and this is a practice that you feel like you must religiously and socially engage in day and night throughout your life, that creativity does not exist like in a vacuum, right? Like that there is so much pressure then to make meaning, to make positive meaning, and then to put a lot of emphasis in your thinking and to help that believing part, that positive meaning, to shape your experience of garments, even as they are physically uncomfortable. And so there's a lot of tension then in women's experiences. So a pretty common response that we saw from conforming women, again, not describing all conforming women, because there's still a range of experiences, was to say something like, in responding to a question like, how do you feel when you're wearing your garments? They'd be like, I feel great about what my garments mean. Here's what my garments mean, but I don't like garments as underwear, right? Like, and so we can describe it as creativity, but the meaning making is kind of born out of the pressure, the social and religious pressure, and then the tension with the body. We must kind of foreground the embodied experiences for both men and women in this meaning making process, where the creativity is born out of a necessity, right? Like and on the other side of that is, I know that if I cannot make positive meanings of this, my faith, I don't know what's going to happen to my faith. I don't know what's going to happen to my belief. I don't know how that's going to impact my relationships to my spouse, to my family, to my community, where those are really big impacts. So yeah.
So if I can tie in there, let's just do one final question, because I've already taken so much of your time, but this ties in perfectly to the last question I want to ask is that, and this is often a subtle scholarly intervention that maybe only a few overspecialized nerds like me will fully understand. But I really appreciate how the book Complicated Notions of Agency, which is, I think, what you're going on here, that sometimes there's this notion, especially in Mormon studies, that we need to emphasize how women are, agents of their own and are expressing their own individuality. But as your last answer kind of affirms, that we need to understand the patriarchal power dynamics at play. And you do this by detailing how different faith and gender backgrounds introduce what you call costs to these choices activities. So maybe as a way to kind of summarize, what do you mean by these costs of adaptation, and how do they help us understand the modern Mormon experience?
Yeah, so we can understand costs as like the kind of burdens. Those might be psychological or faith related or body related, like what people have to experience to make something work. And so what we want to understand is that the costs for example, conforming men to wear their garments are probably relatively low compared to the other three groups that we surveyed, and that the costs to women, not of taking their garments off, which there are different costs, but of wearing garments, like of engaging in this religious practice, are not neutral, right? Like they are often high. That there is a lot of personal, physical sacrifice of comfort, of health that might go into engaging in this religious practice for women, non-conforming and conforming women. And for non-conforming men, there are going to be maybe different costs. There are going to be psychological costs that in the process of feeling like they are being controlled by the church and their underwear choices, that's going to create some significant psychological discomfort for them. And so that secrecy keeps all of these costs hidden from these different groups, because we're not sharing our embodied experiences and our experiences with garments and the messiness of that those costs are hidden to the very people who make decisions and govern and surveil in temple recommend interviews how people wear their garments, and that keeps the whole system in place. And so there are, one thing we want to understand with garments foundationally is that this religious requirement is experienced by different people with different identities, with different belief orientations in very different ways. And some people pay very high costs to wear their garments. And that isn't broadly acknowledged by the community, especially when people are talking about struggles.
Excellent. Very, very smart. And that reflects kind of the nuanced analysis that I found in the book. Thank you so much, Nancy and Larissa, for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks again to Nancy and Larissa for joining me and answering my long-winded questions. I hope you found it as useful and informative as I did. I found the book exceptionally careful and provocative. It's, of course, touching a sensitive topic for many Latter-day Saints, but I thought it did it with dignity and respect. Here are a few things that I really enjoyed in the book. I thought it was very sympathetic to LDS believers, capturing the vigor with which Latter-day Saints approach the practice of garments and really tapping into the deep-seated and sincere beliefs. I thought that they were great at understanding the nuance and diversity of the variety of different perspectives, not morphing them into a homogeneous idea, even within the various different categories. I thought that their personal experiences made the narrative grounded and personal, especially the use of the narratives provided by the survey participants themselves. As a historian, I was appreciative of the history chapter talking about garments from the Joseph Smith age to the present, talking about how garments were seen as both progressive and orthodox, and how those tensions were embedded within the garment tradition from the very beginning. And even as a historian who has dug into the topic, I learned some new things, and I'm sure you will as well. And most importantly, on a theoretical level, I thought the book does a lot to challenge the notions of agency with a well-attuned ear to power structures and the patriarchal climate in which garments are introduced, overseen, and experienced. Of course, I have my own quibbles with the book, but they are real quibbles, especially given the disciplinary differences between me as a historian and them providing more anthropological, sociological approaches. They themselves point out that I can't wait to see more done with the LGBTQ experience and garments, something that is not really addressed here, which they admit. I really appreciated their comparisons to the evangelical culture and the broader right-wing religiosity. I don't think those connections ever hit a firm ground, although I appreciate it, and I think they're right, even if they don't have the direct connections yet. And further, and again, this is not so much a critique as much as highlighting what they themselves would admit, while their massive data set of survey has clear positives, which I've highlighted before and which came out in the interview, it also leads to an impossibility of categorizing. And I think because of the open-ended nature of the survey, it means that yes, we get this wide variety, but we can't really tell how representative these answers are, which the authors themselves, would readily admit. But again, I think these are quibbles because overall, I found the book exceptionally well done, thoughtful, respectful, about as much as you would hope for on this topic, which is why I think it's a book that I strongly recommend. Latter-day Saint garments hold an very awkward space in the modern church in that they are very intimate, yet also exceptionally public. They are deeply personal, institutionally private, yet outwardly performative. And which means that it's often hard to discuss these garments in a way that reflects both the significance and power to the practitioners, while still respecting the sense of sacred and silence that is implied by the institution. And even if the LDS Church itself has evolved substantially in the last decade in how they talk about garments, that sacred aspect has stood firm, making it very difficult to address in public, but I think this book does a good job in working within those parameters. Because garments remain very relevant to understanding modern LDS, and a reminder of why history remains as relevant as ever. I hope you found this video useful. If so, hit the like button, share with others, subscribe to the channel, and become a member if you want to give back. I really enjoy being able to do these videos, digging into these new books, interviewing authors, because I think they remind us why scholarship is so important to adding to these vigorous and significant discussions already going on in our society.